I just want to talk to you about the development of oral vaccines for badgers, and I suppose I want to show you sort of the Irish perspective on the issue of badger tuberculosis. You know, it's the same disease that you have over here in the UK, and basically the solutions that we envisage are exactly the same solutions that are available over here. And in that regard, we work very closely with Mark Chambers and his colleagues at the HVLA and at a much higher department level as well, to try and find a common way of dealing with the problem. Yeah, so I suppose, how do we see the problem? Well, we've got two units here. We've got the issue of cattle, which is our primary interest, and you know we have a problem in both countries in cattle-to-cattle transmission, and that's basically why we're here today. Again, how do we solve this problem, given that we have the second issue in the background, and that's the disease in the badger. Now, in a way, these can be looked at quite separately because we don't know an awful lot about the interactions between these two groups. But I suppose one point I would like to make is that the fact that you have disease in badgers doesn't automatically imply that you get disease in cattle at any level. I mean, you could have 100% disease in badgers, but if they never interacted with cattle, then it wouldn't be an issue, and we wouldn't be here today. But I suppose we live in the real world, and there's a very, very complex set of interactions between badgers and cattle. I suppose fundamentally they do share the same environment. And what I've just put up here is just sort of some arrows. Just what it does, it illustrates the complexity of these interactions. And basically, I suppose I have one here, the driver between the badger and the cattle. And again, I say just because you have the diseased badger, it really depends on the interactions that badger has with the cattle. In other words, that dictates the frequency of the transmission events. And again, some of these events are much more probable than others. Obviously, cattle to cattle is going to be highly probable where you have infected animals, simply because of the density of herding. Again, if you've got high density badger populations, you're more likely to get transmission between these two animals. So at its very simplest, we have some understanding of the cattle to cattle problem and the badger to badger problem. But again, in between, you have all this vast, complexity of interactions. And that's basically part and parcel of the problem that we're trying to solve. Okay, so what's the situation in Ireland regards to badgers? Well, in all the surveys we do, I think we're in the order of 100,000 badgers in the Republic. I'm always amazed at the stock footage I see on the newsworks over here. In the UK, where you see 15 to 20 badgers out feeding in a forest in the evening. We never see that in Ireland. Our densities are much, much lower. And in fact, our densities are probably down to one to two animals per square kilometre. So I think there are some fundamental differences between the population structures in both countries. Yeah. Tuberculosis is endemic in badgers in Ireland. In other words, it's found in every county. In all the agricultural land, if you go in there, you will find infected badgers, irrespective of the TB rates in cattle. There are isolated populations where we don't see disease, but in general, if we look at farmland and we take badgers out, we always find TB at some level in those badgers. Again, where we have problems in the cattle, and when I say problems, I'm talking about the chronic tuberculosis. In other words, these are areas where you have breakdowns year after year and are very difficult to deal with. And in those areas, when we look at the disease prevalence in badgers, we find that there's approximately 50% of the badgers in those areas have got TB. So there is an association between high levels of chronic TB and high levels of tuberculosis in badgers. I suppose the corollary to that, and the question that's often been asked is, well, what happens in areas where there's no TB in cattle? Well, we went back and we did a study to look at that. And we looked at cattle herds which were free of TB for at least 5 years, and most were in the order of 5 to 10 years free of tuberculosis. And when we looked at the badger populations in those areas, we found that the badgers had only 15% tuberculosis. So there seems to be a gradient in the levels of disease in the badger populations, and that's something I'll come back to in a few minutes. We have a fairly strong epidemiological link between the disease in badgers and cattle, and that's very similar to the work that's done over here with the strain typing. In other words, the strains that you would find up in the northwest of Ireland are shared between badgers and cattle, and they're quite different from the strains you would find in the south of Ireland. And then if you get movement of cattle, you find that the strains tend to move with the cattle, but you don't see the different strains appearing in the badger population. And as you'll be well aware, we currently, part of our program is to control by focal reactive culling of the badders. In other words, this is triggered by breakdowns in cattle and tends to be concentrated in those areas where you have chronic cattle TB. And they're the areas where we issue licenses to remove the badders. And it's in those badger populations that we find the highest level of tuberculosis. And in general, over time, we can tend to clear up those areas of TB by that reactive culling and by sort of diligence with the testing and and including the gamma interferon testing in the cattle. So the first thing we want to look at is, well, what is the problem in badgers? We keep hearing these figures quoted, and it can be difficult actually to work through the literature and find out, what is the prevalence in badders, and is it important? And it is and it isn't. It's only important because of those interactions with cattle. If the level of disease in the badgers itself is something that exists, it's what we have, but it doesn't describe the risk to cattle. Okay, but we wanted to find out what level we were dealing with, because this is important from a vaccination point of view. I mean, if all the badgers are vaccinated, if all the badgers are infected in an area, well, following on from Rosie's talk earlier on, well, the vaccine simply isn't going to work because the animals are all infected. So what is the problem? Well, if we look at post-mortem examinations, which is the fastest, simplest way of looking at the levels of disease, when we do sort of an extended post-mortem examination in areas where we've got big problems in cattle, we find about 22.7, roughly 23% of the badgers have got TB. Now, if we look more intensively at those badgers and add in histopathology and a lot more labour-intensive bacteriology, we can see that using bacteriology, our infection rate suddenly jumps to 43%. And again, if we interpret those results in parallel, in other words, if they're positive to any one of these three tests, which are quite specific, well, that's where we get our level, approximately 50% in those badger populations. So again, when we go out and measure our routine post-mortem examination, we can multiply that figure by 2 or 2.5, and that gives us a sort of a crude estimate as to the actual real level of infection in those particular badger populations. And again, a less intensive post-mortem inspection will give lesion rates of around 14-15%, and those figures I see published over here, and they're the figures we would actually routinely see at that sort of the very fast routine post-mortem. So in terms of vaccination, we would multiply that figure by 3 to give us a sort of a more accurate estimate of the level of disease in the population. So this is just a quick overview of the vaccine development program. We've carried out a series of pen studies over the years. Again, these are the captive studies that Mark was referring to. Yeah, we've done a lot of work on developing the diagnostics along with VLA. This has led us to our field trial, vaccine field trial, which has been running for the last 3.5 years. We're coming to the end of that now, and again, we're looking at applications, strategies, the ways that we will actually deliver the vaccine to populations. Again, there's all the issues that Mark brought up, the registration, the licensing of the vaccine, which takes a considerable length of time. But again, all this is leading us to the development of a field vaccine. And as Mark pointed out, there are candidates out there that we're sort of getting close to developing that will probably be the vaccine of choice when it comes to putting into the field. So we're hopeful in the next couple of years we'll actually have defined what our field vaccine is going to look like. And then in parallel at the same time, we'll work through all the various licensing issues so that we'll have our product hopefully in the next 5 or 6 years it's fully licensed. But I'll be hopeful that in the next 3 or 4 years that we will have the candidate vaccine that we know we can bring forward to licensing. Okay, much of our work was done in a large captive facility that we have on the outside Dublin, where we have a lot of different pens. And we also have cattle sheds there with tunnels between the pens, so we can actually allow the badgers to interact with cattle. And we're currently doing studies looking at these interactions via CCTV and looking to see can we get transmission from the badgers to the cattle. Because only then will we start getting some understanding of these issues, this big black box, as I described it, as to what are the nature of the interactions that lead to transmission. And until we know something about that, it's very difficult, as Rosie said, to actually estimate how vaccination will actually impact on that type of transmission. So hopefully this will be a fertile ground for results in the next year or two. We're just finishing off these transmission studies now at the moment, and hopefully we'll have the results early next year. Again, that just illustrates what the pens look like. It's an outdoor complex where we keep the badgers sort of in a sort of simulated natural environment. And again, we've developed all the techniques for infecting the badgers, giving maximum protection to the worker. So what have we actually achieved? Well, I suppose in the last 10 years, as Mark pointed out, we've developed a whole suite of diagnostics for tuberculosis in badgers, which simply weren't there when we started off about 10 years ago. We've determined the protective efficacy of BCG against experimental infection. We've shown that BCG works in badgers irrespective of the route that you give it. If you give it intramuscular, subcutaneous, by aerosol, by oral vaccination, if you get the BCG established in the badger, it actually works quite well against experimental infection. Again, we've done some, test the efficacy against natural MBOS challenge in our field trial, which I'll describe in a moment. It's all very well with the experimental infections, but does it work in the field? That's the big question. And again, we're working with the VLA at evaluating candidate vaccines that we'll bring forward to licensing. Again, this is the type of model that we use. It just, again, illustrates what Mark showed. In general, you would have 2 or 3 groups. You'd have your control group and then your vaccinated group. Here we had 2 groups vaccinated with 2 different strains of the BCG. And you can see there's a big difference in the protection. This is just based on post-mortem score between the Pasteur and the Danish strains and the control groups here. And I'd like to point out an issue, because I keep seeing it coming up, people saying, well, the experiment really hasn't worked because the vaccinated animals are infected. Yeah, and that's true, because this is an experimental model. And you can't actually do the experiment if you don't get infection, because you've nothing to compare it against. So what you do here is you contrive the experiment to get infection. Yeah. So if you see any differences like you do here in the vaccine, that actually tells you the vaccine is working very well. Because if it works against this very strong challenge against M. bovis, well, out in the field, it's going to be exposed to much lower doses. So this actually underestimates how good the vaccine is. So despite the fact they're infected, we're always very happy when we see this type of result. And again, we can measure all the immune responses, and you can see the immune responses of the 2 vaccines groups are actually quite different to the control group. And this gives us some confidence that the immune tests that we're developing are actually quite good and can be applicable in the field as well. So the badger field trial that you've probably heard something about, it's been running for 3 years. And again, the principal objective is to demonstrate that BCG works against natural transmission. In other words, we've shown that it works in captive badgers, but does it protect out in the field? Ultimately, the vaccine is no use if it doesn't. So we're working in an area of County Kilkenny, just there southwest of Dublin. We have a couple of secondary objectives. Again, it's to study post-infection vaccination. In other words, this issue just keeps coming up. What happens if you vaccinate badgers that are already infected? Well, they will have been vaccinated in this field trial, so we'll be able to investigate that at the end of the study. And again, it'll provide all of the infrastructure for further research and understanding how we were able to develop the vaccine and address the policy and the scientific interests. It's a large area, 700 square kilometres. TB starting prevalence is about 30%, and I say it's been running for 3 years. We've divided into 3 zones. In the top zone, it's a blind study, so in the top or bottom zone, we have 100% vaccination. In the middle zone, we have 50%. That's the only one we're sure about. And in the third zone, we've got 0%. We've got the placebo. So this allows us to measure both susceptibility, efficacy of susceptibility, and infectiousness in the badgers as a result of the vaccination. We have 2 sweeps per year. We revaccinate every second sweep. This will simulate badgers getting revaccinated every second year. We monitor the population by serology, and at the end we're actually removing 300 badgers, and we're going to use post-mortem examination to measure the vaccine effect in these badgers. And we should have the initial results of the study in the next 6 to 7 months. So injectable versus oral vaccination, it's already been touched on. This is just my perspective. The injectable vaccine, it's available now. It's a defined delivery dose, as Mark pointed out, and we've sort of expectations of protection of the individual, because we have the captive work to deal with. So at face value, it seems very attractive, whereas oral vaccine still needs to be licensed. Dose never guaranteed. What I mean by that is that badgers are no different than us in the way they eat cream crackers, so we can never guarantee the way that they're going to eat the badger, going to eat the bait is going to be exactly the same each time. This will lead to higher variability. So on the face of it, injectable vaccines seems to win. I've deliberately left out cost, because cost is always a factor here, and it would apply on both sides of the equation. But the big but is, injectable vaccine, it may be difficult to generate population immunity. Because you're relying on capturing each individual badger, it might be difficult to get that level of herd immunity where you confer protection against the unvaccinated portion of the population. That might be much more difficult to achieve. Whereas with oral vaccine, with the optimal delivery system, you can target large populations to get that herd immunity, which is really what you're striving to do. You're not all that interested in individual immunity, it's immunity in the population. So what do we need to know? Well, as Rosie pointed out and illustrated very well, we need to know some fundamental information on badger population structure and the epidemiology of the transmission, because that's really going to dictate how successful the vaccine is going to be. So again, when we look in Ireland, we have these three different sort of range of prevalences. In the chronic TB areas, we've got very high level of disease. In the TB-free areas, we've got 15% disease in the badgers. And then we have in between, we have a 25% rate. And these are sort of cattle herds that just sort of break down year after year and then get cleared up fairly fast. So we seem to have a gradient of disease in the badgers throughout the country. And this is very important to know in terms of the vaccine. Again, the population structure, this is like the families that Rosie pointed out early on. In Ireland, as I said, our density is very low. You can see our group sizes are mostly 67 badgers all in sort of one group, very few large groups of 9. But you see the prevalence is the same, irrespective of the size of the social group. So this tells us that the population structure is actually quite loose, and there's a lot of mixing among the badgers, and that the individual is effectively the same as the population. Again, when we keep getting told that it won't work because we can't vaccinate cubs. Well, not all the transmission is in cubs, because you can see here, if you break it down, you can see as the animal gets older, the risk of getting disease actually increases. So there's an age-associated risk with the disease, and actually the juveniles have the lowest risk. And not surprisingly, as we always find, males are more likely to be infected than females, and this is probably because of behaviour and biting. So who do we vaccinate? I'll just finish off now. Well, if we vaccinate individual badgers, again, we have some expectation of vaccine effects, but doesn't tell us an awful lot at the individual level. Social groups, highest risk transmission because they congregate together, and again, you might get dispersal with culling or whatever and perturbation. Really what you do is regional, because regional targets the whole population, and you get this level of herd immunity, and you're much more likely to have a long-term effect in the population. How do we vaccinate? Well, Mark pointed out we need to develop an efficient delivery system. The target is maybe 70 to 80% of the population. How often do we vaccinate? Well, individual badgers, depends on the duration of immunity. Well, we don't know yet, but we might guess that it's maybe 1 to 2 years an individual badger. But at a regional level, it doesn't really matter about the individual protection. What we want is to maintain this herd immunity, the high proportion of the population that's affected. So that's the most important thing. Yeah. When do we stop vaccination? That's very important. What's our exit strategy? And this is my last point. Well, if the objective is just to control the disease in badgers, then the problem is there's no end point. In other words, we're accepting the status quo that we vaccinate badgers to a certain level, TB rates hopefully drop in cattle, and we say, okay, we're happy with that. The problem with that strategy is that you're forever condemned to vaccinating your badger population for all the reasons that Rosie mentioned earlier. There are always new susceptibles coming into the population. So there is no end point to vaccination if your ambition is just to control the disease. So the way our preference is, I think your objective has to be to eradicate the disease in badgers. Because if you eradicate the disease in badgers, you have a finite endpoint. Now that finite endpoint is very difficult because it means you have to eradicate the disease completely in every last badger and take into account urban badgers and everything. But if that's your goal, you really need to target that program. And that's effectively what they're doing in New Zealand now with the possums. They've got to the stage where they've reduced the levels of TB in cattle, but they still have a problem in the possums. So they have a 15-year plan now to actually achieve eradication of the disease in the possums. I think we followed the New Zealanders for a long time in their approach. I think we should follow them this way and actually set our bar high and actually use vaccination to eradicate the disease. Thank you very much. There's some of my colleagues that I'd like to acknowledge.